You ready? Morning. For those of you here and anybody at home that has not seen the first part of this series, they are all up on our YouTube page, so you can start from the beginning if you have not seen them all. And if you have not, to make more sense, it would at least be a good idea to watch the first three. I've recommended that to some other people already. We are discussing the Ten Commandments, and we are going to take a considerable period of time this morning to discuss commandment number 4. Now, we have talked about these commandments as being the moral code of God. And I know for me, for a long time, it has been a problem as to why keep the Sabbath is in our moral code. And we're going to talk about that today, and I'm going to come up with some ideas that I have thought about for some time now, and you guys will see whether or not you agree or disagree, but I'm going to present anyway. So I'm going to ask, I've got a lot of material here, I'm going to ask for no questions until the end today, because I want to make sure I get through this, please. In Exodus, we see 2 commandments that predate the 10 Commandments. I want you to think about that for a minute. We've already seen those in our study that we did previously. One of these is from the ceremonial law, and one of them is from the moral law. The first one is the Passover. And it is an example of a ceremonial law that is given in Exodus chapter 12, and we are studying from Exodus chapter 20. So that was before they ever reached Mount Sinai and were given the 10 Commandments. In fact, the Passover was integral to their leaving Egypt. The second one is in Exodus chapter 16, starting in verse 25, where we see the initial Sabbath law given to Israel before God ever wrote those 10 words on tablets. 6 days they were to gather manna, gather a double portion on the 6th day, but on the 7th day they were to rest and not gather any food. This idea of resting is an important theme throughout the entire Bible. We see the idea of rest and Sabbath all the way from the beginning of Genesis to the end of Revelation. But one might ask, why would this commandment of resting on the Sabbath or keeping the Sabbath be included in God's moral law as given in the 10 Commandments? There are no other civil or ceremonial laws found in those 10. So, why is the idea of Sabbath or rest included in God's moral law at Sinai? At first glance, it seems out of place, at least to me. And this is a question as I just said, I've pondered for a long time. In a previous lesson, we discussed in detail how modern dictionaries, both secular, like Webster's, as well as Bible dictionaries, give definitions of Sabbath that are either incomplete or, worse yet, I believe they are totally, plainly wrong. For instance, Webster's says that the Sabbath includes Sunday observed among Christians as a day of rest and worship. And the Easton Bible Dictionary says that Sabbath is a universal obligation and that man is so constituted that his bodily welfare needs at least 1 day in 7 to rest from ordinary labor. It goes on to state that by experience, notice I've underlined that word, experience, the reason for observance of the Sabbath lies deep in the everlasting necessity of human nature. And finally, it says, this is also the Bible Dictionary, we can give no text authorizing the change in so many words. We have no express law declaring this change of the day, and they're talking about from Saturday to Sunday at this point, or no change. The Sabbath remains as a sacred institution. And the only thing I agree with that entire statement is that it is a sacred institution. Okay? In other words, no one can point to any Bible scripture that actually says the Sabbath changed to Sunday in the New Testament, but we know it must be true because of our own experience, which, well, I'm not going to get into that right now. The concepts of Sabbath and rest have been debated endlessly over the centuries, and what society, both religious and secular, believes is true about the Sabbath day and the idea of resting is, for the most part, I believe, wrong. We know that the seventh day, 7-day week, the idea of a 7-day week, has been around for a long time. Ancient cultures in both Babylonia and Mesopotamia used calendars that were based on divisions of time into weeks of 7 days, as do our calendars today. Now, yes, there are examples of society attempting to change to a 5-day week or a 10-day week, but this was always done. Every time it's been done, it was with the hope that it would be able to be used to destroy Christianity and establish atheism as a norm for society. Here I've got a couple of examples of what I mean. On the right, we've got the Soviet Union and their calendar where they tried to do this after the communism took over, and on the left they did the same thing during the French Revolution.
The other way around.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you're right. My left. But yes, we also know that it was Constantine who ruled the Roman Empire from 306 to 337 AD. It was him that first established Sunday to be a Christian Sabbath. He proclaimed on the venerable day of the sun, the magistrates and people residing in the cities rest, and let all workshops be closed. Note that this was 300 years after the church was established, so it wasn't something that was done biblically by the apostles or whatever. Many people do acknowledge the connection between the Genesis account of creation and the 7-day week. For them, this counting of the days of the week is accidental. But I don't believe it's accidental. But there are just as many people that claim to be religious that do not understand how the concepts of Sabbath and rest are used in the Bible as a whole. We have said that God's law, as given to Israel, has 3 parts: the civil, the ceremonial, and the moral laws. And that it is God's moral law which is being stated in the 10 Commandments. Yes, this moral part of the law was being given on Sinai specifically to Israel. They were the ones that were supposed to keep it. They were supposed to pass it on. They were supposed to preserve it for all of history. But none of these laws, as we discussed before, were anything new. Yes, the world by the time of Moses had obviously forgotten these rules or had skewed them beyond recognition. But each of them can be found in both Genesis, or in Genesis in another form, or in one form or another. For many years, I knew this to be the case, but could not ever reconcile the commandment about keeping the Sabbath and how it was included with the other universal moral code given by God to Moses to the people of Israel. But I believe it is because of our basic lack of understanding of what the Sabbath and rest really are that kind of causes this confusion. When we look at, I guess I skipped that one. When we look at Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 2, it says, "And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day for all his work that he had done." So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested for all his work, from all his work that he had done in creation. The word rest in this passage is Shabbath, or in Hebrew it's actually without the vowels as they write, is SHBT. It means a range of things from peaceful, quiet, remainder, what is left behind, settle down or stay settled, place of quiet, cause to cease or make to cease. It is important to note that nothing in this passage states or implies that God was tired of creating, so he rested. This word does not mean that. It simply means God stopped working. And because this happened on day 7, I believe at that moment the 7-day week was born. But I also believe that this idea of rest, as described in Genesis, was meant to mean more than just God stopping his labors. The Hebrew word also means place of quiet and settled down. This is very important. God had a plan for this rest from the very beginning. And that plan included man, God's image bearers. Man in and of himself was not the sole purpose of creation. We're taught that a lot, but I do not believe that's totally true. God's purpose also included what happened immediately after man was created, and that was the rest instituted by God between God and man. That's important, and I don't believe it's brought out enough. The rest that God and his images were to settle down in the garden. God wanted to dwell with his newly formed images in a peaceful and quiet rest. Speaking of God's rest in Genesis chapter 2, it says, there's a man named Abraham Heschel, who, this is a quote for him, talking about rest. He says, "Last in creation, first in intention. The Sabbath is the end of the creation of heaven and earth. The goal of all creation was not simply to create a man. The purpose of all creation was to create an image that would live in a place of quiet rest with God. That is what God had greatly desired since the very beginning, and it is what God continued to desire throughout this long history about how a holy and righteous God can once again dwell with an unholy people, for those of you that remember hearing that many times before. Man became lost because he thought he was the whole purpose of creation. So Adam and Eve attempted to become wise on their own. And in doing so, they disobeyed God and made their own rules. Think about this for a minute. If you broke most of the Old Testament rules, all you would have to do is go and offer a sacrifice or stay away for a while until you were clean again. But the people of Israel were stoned to death for breaking the Sabbath. Why? Seems trivial. This was because they broke God's ultimate purpose for creation. God and man resting together. And so Jesus said, come unto me, all of you who are heavy laden, and I will give you that. Give you what? I will give you what was lost in the garden. Jesus was offering to give back the rest that was lost at the garden, beginning when Adam and Eve were driven out of the garden to the east of Eden. The 7-day week was established because of what took place in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. Otherwise, I don't believe there would be any need for us to even mark time, because they would have lived forever and time wouldn't have been important. And because of this, the number 7 became a special significant number, the perfect number or the complete number, as we've discussed here before. But does the actual 7th day of the week constitute the rest that God is talking about in the Bible? Much of the world today thinks that is true. In fact, the Lexham Bible Dictionary says that a day of complete rest from secular work following 6 days of labor. I don't think that's what it's talking about. Exodus chapter 16. The word holy, Sabbath, and rest are all used in that passage. The Hebrew word for Sabbath, as we just said, was Shabbath. It is a slightly different word than the one that's used back in Genesis chapter 2 that we mentioned above. That particular word comes from a different Strong's number, which is the same word used in Genesis for rest. Therefore, it brings with it the same meanings of peaceful, quiet, remain, all the things that we just said: place of quiet, cause to cease, etc., to settle down. This same word is also used in Exodus chapter 16, verses 25, 26, and 29. In that sense, Sabbath and rest are basically the same word and convey the same meaning. The word used for 7 in Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3 is also used in Exodus chapter 16:30. The Hebrew word is shevii. It is not related to the word for Sabbath or the word rest, but it is that idea of 7 days leading to rest, as seen in Genesis and in the rest of the Pentateuch, that these dictionaries, both religious and secular, that we've just been talking about, get their notion that man needs to rest every 7 days. But is this true? And why did God tell Israel to rest or Sabbath every 7 days? Was it because Israel would get tired? Again, I don't think that was the case, and I don't think that's what we're being told in this passage. Let's look at a couple of other Old Testament examples to see what I'm talking about, kind of see what I mean. When God established the Day of Atonement, and when he established the Passover, he did so by telling Israel to keep them once a year. But the significance of these events is not the number of repetitions within a given period of time. Like the Sabbath, they've emphasized the period of time. With the Passover, with the Day of Atonement, we're not emphasizing the period of time. So in other words, they're applying a different rule to one than they are to the other, I think. The Passover lamb was what? It was a symbol or a type of the final sacrificial lamb in the form of the promised seed. And the scapegoat from the Day of the Day of Atonement was a symbol of what God would ultimately do with man's sins. He would place them, those sins, on a substitute. These were both allusions to the Messiah and what he would do when he came. We know from past discussions that much of the Old Testament law was ceremonial and symbolic, and therefore was predictive of what was supposed to come. And I believe the same thing is true of the Sabbath. Its ultimate purpose was never to give man relief from the daily grind. It was to, or God, from what he had done. It was to be a symbol of what God intended right from the very beginning of Genesis. The Sabbath was always to be reminiscent of a time when God walked with man in the garden, and it was to look forward to a time when God and man would again dwell together. This was the very basis of that plan. Various parts of the Bible contain bits and pieces of the Sabbath puzzle, and we can put them together if we choose to do so. Only in total can a theology of the Sabbath be fully understood. For instance, there are gradations of Sabbath days throughout the Old Testament. There were Sabbath days within Sabbath weeks and Sabbath weeks within Sabbath years. After the conquest of the land at the time of Joshua, every seventh day was every seventh year was a Sabbath year, so that the land could rest. And that's according to Leviticus chapter 25. Then, after 7 years, in other words, the 49th year, Israel would have to mark the 50th, which was the year of Jubilee, when everybody returned the land to their possessions. And the 50th year was also year one of the next sabbatical cycle. Also, the Day of Atonement, though it occurred on the 10th day every year of the 7th month, was always regarded as a Sabbath day. That's according to Leviticus chapter 16 and Leviticus chapter 23. Regardless of the day of week it fell on. It wasn't Saturday always. In fact, quite often it probably was not. And during the Feast of the Tabernacle, the first 8 days of that feast week were all considered Sabbath rest days. The point is that there were many different Sabbaths during the Old Testament covenant, depending upon the day of the week of the feast, and the cycle of the year. These various Sabbaths are all reflections of God's true rest for creation. And every one of them reinforced the idea that God wishes to rest or dwell with his people, not on a specific day of the week necessarily, but on a continual basis throughout eternity. From this perspective, the Sabbath was never meant to be about a specific day. It was more of a place where man can dwell at peace or at rest with God, a place like and unto and similar to Eden. Hebrews chapter 4 tells the whole Bible story in a nutshell, and it does so with a theme of rest. The writer goes all the way back to creation, and then he states that, I lost it. Is that it? Sorry about this. I don't know why I lost that. Now I don't know for sure if I'm on the right slide. This doesn't look right at all. Well, we'll see in a minute. The writer goes on, and then he says, "You shall never enter my rest." He is speaking of a rebellious Israel the rebellious Israel of the Old Testament. Yet these Israelites had kept a Sabbath every 7 days for a long, long period of time. And they did enter the promised land, which was the so-called land of rest. So why did God have Israel keep a Sabbath rest every 7 days and have them enter the promised land of rest and keep the Sabbaths during the feast, only to be told they will never enter God's rest. I believe that it is no different than the other ceremonial or parts of the Old Testament law. The Old Testament ceremonial law was meant to foreshadow what would happen when the promised seed was revealed. Unclean animals foreshadowed those living in sin, and they also foreshadowed the Gentiles. Lambs and other sacrifices foreshadowed the sacrifice of Christ. Ceremonial washings foreshadowed the necessity of being holy like God is holy. The high priest foreshadowed Christ. The tabernacle foreshadowed a place to dwell with God. And the most holy place, of course, foreshadowed heaven. And there are many more of these kinds of things that were all meant for one main reason. They were all meant to be a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, to prefigure something that was to come and point us in the right direction so that we would understand God's plan and know and recognize the predicted Son when he came. And so it is, I believe, with the idea of rest and with the Sabbath. Mankind needed to know that there was a rest still coming. The rest was lost, but God still desired to dwell with his images. Do not fail to enter, it is quoted. This is part of what Hebrews is trying to show us. This is what Jesus argued with the Pharisees about when he said, when they said he was working on the Sabbath. God had intended that the Jewish people keep this idea of rest or a Sabbath with God alive until the true rest in the form of Jesus could come. Through this part of the ceremonial law, we would know the concept of God's true rest, and it would not be forgotten because they would keep it in a ceremonial way. But instead, many of the Jewish rulers had defamed it and turned it into part of their religious checklist. We read in the Bible that the Pharisees condemned Jesus and the disciples for not keeping the Sabbath. Jesus healed on the Sabbath. He cast out demons on the Sabbath. His disciples plucked grain off from stalks of a field on the Sabbath because they were hungry. The list is long. Alfred Edersheim is a Jewish scholar, author, and believer in Jesus the Christ. And he charges the scribes of Jesus' time with terribly exaggerated views on the Sabbath and endless burdensome rules with which they encumbered everybody connected with its sanctity. And this is in his book. I believe it's Jesus Christ the what? I do? Yeah, Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. I get that confused a little bit with the Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean. Which, if some of you have seen it, it's a movie, but I don't know if that movie got its name from Edersheim's book or not, but I always found it as a coincidence. He goes on to say, in not less than 24 chapters, and this is of the Mishnah, which is one of the main Jewish writings, matters are seriously discussed regarding the Sabbath observance as if they were vital religious importance, which one would scarcely imagine a sane intellect would seriously entertain. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples from his book. He has a list and an appendices in the back of some of the really, really way out, weird, silly Sabbath rules, ones that are not in the Bible, but Jesus is only dealing with a very few of these. First one, The standard measure of a forbidden food was the size of an olive. The illegal size of carrying burdens was the weight of a fig. If a man swallowed a half an olive-sized piece of forbidden food and it stayed in its stomach, it was okay. But if he began to swallow it and it came back up and then he swallowed it again, then it was considered that he was considered being guilty of breaking the Sabbath. But if a man carried the weight of a fig and put it down and then picked it back up again and carried it, he was guiltless. So you could do one and you couldn't do the other. You could bring up the food and you were guilty, but you could put down the fig and bring it back up outside the body and you weren't guilty. Next one. The idea of an object being thrown into the air with the left hand and caught with the right was a debated Sabbath legal question. If the object was thrown and caught with the same hand, it was a sin. But he was not guilty if he caught it in his mouth, since he would eat it and then the object would no longer exist. Which, if you think about it, kind of negates the rule we just talked about. Next, there were regulations that guided how you dressed on the Sabbath. Ladies, be careful here. You would not put on anything that might become burdensome during the day, because then you might have to take it off later in the day. And if you were to take something off and then had to carry it around and it was bigger than whatever that piece of fig was, then that wasn't good. And a woman could not wear a headdress that would require loosening before a bath later in the day, nor could she wear ornaments that might need to be taken off during the Sabbath, even if she was just going to show her friends. Here, try on this necklace. Nope, can't do that. And we got one more here. It was okay for friends to carry a living person on his pallet if he could not walk. Yet, it was forbidden to carry a dead person on a pallet on the Sabbath. But we know from the Bible that the lame man was also condemned for carrying his own pallet on the Sabbath when Jesus healed him. If you know the backstory of this, you know how disgusted Jesus was becoming with what they had turned the Sabbath into. And it had nothing basically to do with any of these silly laws. There were thousands of these stupid Sabbath rules. But Jesus knew what the Sabbath really meant. And so he condemned them for their exploitation of something that was simply meant to be a reminder and a foreshadowing of man's special communion with God. The rest, or the Sabbath of the Old Testament, was a symbol or foreshadowing of God's true rest. Hebrews chapter 4 verse 9 tells us, there still remains a rest for the people of God. And in 4:11 it says, let us be diligent to enter that rest. In Hebrews, same chapter, verse 10 tells us that Jesus tells us that this heavenly rest that we have yet to enter will be a time when we cease from our work as God ceased from his. In it, it is Jesus, the Word that was present in creation, who states, come to me and I will give you rest. Jesus is not talking about rest from being tired for weeks of work, for a week's work. Jesus is the Sabbath, and he is the way to the Sabbath. The Sabbath rest between God and man was the plan all along. When the creation was all done and there was to be peace, and rest between God and man. And for God, this rest was all about man living in a relationship with God. Even though it was initially lost, the Sabbath was originally created for man to dwell in peace with God. And it is through faith in God's Son that this Sabbath rest is going to return to those that believe. Again, let's go back to the dictionaries. We have A, the Sabbath day of the seventh day of the week, observed from Friday evening to Saturday evening as a rest day and worship by Jews and some Christians. B, Sunday observed among Christians as a day of rest and worship. And C, time of rest. I think it is plain to see that A is partially true. This is what the Jewish Christians and legalists made the Sabbath out to be. And that B is just not true at all. Neither of these tell what the Sabbath really is. Bible dictionaries do not fare much better in their definitions. But even though Webster's does not really know what the Bible is saying, it still gets the third definition kind of correct. The Sabbath is a time of rest. But I don't think that that's something that they did on purpose. I think that it's something that came about by accident. But not from our daily duties, as Webster is implying. That's what he's applying with this Sabbath as a time of rest. It is a time and place of rest where man and God dwell in Sabbath together. I believe that just like Adam had duties and he had to work, when the second rest comes, we're going to have the same thing. We're not going to sit around with wings and just flap around and not doing anything for the rest of eternity, as sometimes it is implied. And that is why I believe it's a place between our relationship with God and with man. In other words, and I'll mention this again here in a second, this commandment, notice where it's placed. I think it's strategically placed. 1, 2, and 3 specifically have to do about our relationship with God. And then 5 through 10 have specifically to do with our relationship between man and our fellow man. And this one is placed in between, number 4. I think it makes it unique. The first 11 chapters of Genesis tell about the fall of mankind and how its devastating effects ruined creation. Genesis chapters 12 through 50 tell of the initial promises made by God, promises that in a physical form would begin to be fulfilled in the book of Exodus. Throughout all the Old Testament, God uses history in story form along with symbols, types, and foreshadowings to begin showing who he is, what he has done, and what he is going to do. And up to this point in the story, God's power and majesty are shown both in the creation and in his defeat of the Egyptian nation. Then, starting with the Passover, in a previous chapter, I forget, was it chapter 12, I think we just mentioned? God selects Israel to keep hundreds of seemingly meaningless rituals. But the old law was full of symbolisms that all point in the direction and purpose of a plan being revealed step by step over time. And the Sabbath, the rest that God would give, is a big part of what God wanted the people to understand and to remember. So, at this point in Exodus, God chooses to unite two important parts of his plan. The bread of life, in other words, the idea of manna, and how it's important that on the seventh day you don't have to, because when you rest, there's going to be plenty of food. And the Sabbath rest of his people. I do not believe that this is accidental. In fact, it is of utmost importance. When the promised seed finally comes, it is he that will be both of these, the bread of life and the promised rest. So, to get this through to Israel, as well as to the world in general, God told Israel to gather the bread that comes from heaven for 6 days, but on the seventh, but on the sixth gather twice as much, because every seventh day I want you to be reminded of what you lost. And I want you to be reminded of what is to come. In Genesis, Adam and Eve were given all the fruit trees in the garden that they could possibly ever eat. More food than we can even imagine. And all of it was very good. In Exodus, Israel also is to see that it was still God that provides and not Pharaoh or his gods. Only this time, God simply provides what Jesus would one day pray for, their daily bread. No more, no less. The idea was for Israel to trust God one day at a time and to make an association between the bread of heaven and the promised rest. Because of their relationship to Abraham, it was through Israel that God would teach the world about himself. These lessons all pertain to showing through Israel's system of rules and regulations, they were meant to show who God was and what he was capable of, while at the same time illustrating by what manner God's salvation would come. God had a plan, and the elements of that plan were woven like a fine thread that runs throughout the entire fabric of the Old Testament law and prophets. Like Jesus said, beginning with Moses and the prophets. And like Peter says, indeed, beginning with Samuel, all the prophets who have spoken have foretold of these days. Like we previously said, it is interesting that these two illustrations were given before Israel ever formally received the law. First, there was the Passover. A lamb and its blood can save. Israel was to remember that. And in Exodus chapter 16, God makes a connection between manna and the bread of life sent by God to his people and the Sabbath rest that had been lost, the rest that God still so desired, a way in which he and his people could again dwell together. The bread of life and the Sabbath rest joined together in such a way that they point to the seed who became both. So, I'm about to give you a definition that I put together, and it's lengthy, but this is what I think is implied in the idea of Sabbath. A place of peace and quiet where we cease to wrestle with God like Jacob did. A place where, unlike Adam and Eve, we respect God's wishes and place his words above our own. It is a place that can only be found by following the path of the promised seed that laid down his life. It is the place foreshadowed in many various places in the Old Testament and finally revealed at the end of the book of Revelation. And it is a place where once and for all the holy and righteous God can dwell with his people. That, I believe, is what the rest in the Bible is talking about, and we miss it. We stated previously that the Ten Commandments, 1 through 4, describe man's relationship to God, and that 5 through 10 describe man's relationship to man. And I think this commandment 4, like I just previously stated, is strategically placed in between those two sections. Keep the Sabbath is placed between those for a good reason, because it is there in God's rest that both man and God can finally once again dwell in peace. The end. Any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for this. This is good, interesting, and I appreciate it a good deal. The comment more is about business, about people making up a whole bunch of rules about the Sabbath that are not in the Bible. They're still doing it today.
Oh, yeah.
The Orthodox Jewish folks, which are primarily in New York City and the United States, but also in the nation of Israel, again, primarily in Jerusalem today, they spend untold hours poring over their commentaries of the Old Testament and rules about the Sabbath and rules about all kinds of other things, and study them unendingly This becomes a significant part of virtually every day of their life to do this. And they debate these things, and they argue these things among each other, and talk about what this rabbi said and what that rabbi said 100 or 1,000 years ago, because they are still obsessed with this idea of getting every tiny detail correct. And they're still making the same mistakes that they were in the first century when Jesus was talking about man wasn't made for the Sabbath was made for man. But they're still doing the same kind of thing of trying to make laws where God has not made a law.
There is a photography store in New York City. I've actually been to it twice, but I have ordered from it for over 40 years. My favorite place in the world to be or to order from. As most of you know, I like photography. It is run by very, very strict Jewish people. I don't know if it's one family or what, but this whole time that I've dealt with them, you can't order from them on Friday. From Friday night to Saturday night. They totally closed down the place. You can look at their website, but you cannot order on their website. Even though there's no hands have to move or do anything, you still can't order from that website. And if they have an extended Jewish holiday for 10 days or 2 weeks, it's closed. And yet, it's, I believe, the biggest photography store in the world. People really know that place. Yeah, what Terry says is true. It's still kept today a lot of places. Anything else? Thank you.